Okay. Okay, good morning. We're now going to complete part 2 of lecture 4. And this lecture focuses on the topic of price discrimination. Okay. And there are basically 3 types of price discrimination that we're going to consider. Okay. The first one is called first degree price discrimination. And I'm just going to show my screen to show you how this works. If you look at the handout on this diagram, figure 2, lecture 5, you will see that the demand curve is drawn from point A to where it intercepts the output axis, and the marginal revenue curve is drawn from point A to where it cuts the output axis at this point here. And we can see that at point D, a competitive firm would produce output QC and sell it at price PC, whereas the monopolist firm would produce QM and sell it at PM. And that gives us a standard result that if you're comparing a monopoly with a competitive industry, we have deadweight loss shown by the triangle C, D, and to this point here. Consumer surplus is under the monopoly is A, C, PM, whereas under the competitive industry, it was A, D, PC. Now with first degree price discrimination, what the monopolist does is he charges each consumer the maximum price that they are willing to pay. So if we look where the demand curve intercepts the price axis, there are people along here who will be prepared to pay a much higher price than PM or PC. And with first degree price discrimination, the monopolist lowers the price, charges each consumer the maximum price they're willing to pay through point C all the way down to point D, after which he would no longer engage in price discrimination, because after point D, the marginal revenue curve price is no longer sufficient to cover costs. So let me show you this using a diagram, and to do this, I'm going to share my screen and go into the whiteboard. So standard diagram, Q, P, A, R. Okay. And MR will be something like this, twice the slope. And we've got marginal cost and average cost. Now, we've got this point here, this point here. Let's call this point A. Let's call this point B. This here is marginal revenue. That cuts marginal cost there. And that gives us P, M there. So there's point A, there's point B, and this is QM. This point here is QC, and this point here is PC. Now, what is happening with first degree price discrimination is the monopolist realizes there are people prepared to pay this price, and 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 this price. But they don't have to, because the price as set by the monopolist, PM, means they only pay the price charged by the monopolist, which is PM, even though there are people willing to pay much higher prices. The monopolist realizes that by engaging in first degree price discrimination, he can move down the demand curve all the way to here and stop at point B. At point B, after point B, price is less than average cost, so it incur losses. So what happens with first degree price discrimination is that the monopolist captures all the consumer surplus, which is shown by the triangle A, B, PC. What that is telling you is that under a monopolist, you get an outcome which is similar to a perfectly competitive outcome, in the sense that we get a perfectly competitive output, QC, and the final price charged for the final unit of output to a consumer at point B is PC. So all of this area here, the triangle ABPC, triangle ABPC, which used to be consumer surplus under a competitive industry, is now transferred entirely to the monopolist. Society is no worse off because what used to be consumer surplus has simply been transferred to the monopolist. And you need to remember that consumer surplus is the difference between the price the consumer is willing to pay and the price they have to pay. So you're getting something which is identical in its outcome to a competitive industry. Okay. Now, first-degree price discrimination assumes that the monopolist knows the maximum price that each consumers are willing to pay, and you have to consider whether that is realistic. There are situations in which a monopolist does know the maximum price which consumers are willing to pay, and one situation for that would be an auction, where as the price increases, consumers drop out of the market until only one consumer is left who is willing to pay the maximum price for that product. Okay. The second type of price discrimination is what is known as the second type of price discrimination is second-degree price discrimination, and I'm going to show you that by showing my screen. I'm going to the PowerPoint and we scroll down. Now, what this diagram is showing, I would actually need to rotate this. I can't do that. What this diagram is showing is a marginal cost curve, which is nonlinear, a linear demand curve, and a linear marginal revenue curve. And what this diagram is showing is that the monopolist, without price discrimination, would set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. So there's marginal cost hitting marginal revenue. That gives us output QM, and that gives us point V, and that is sold at price PM. Now, second-degree price discrimination is sometimes referred to as tariff pricing, and it basically means that the more units of a product a consumer buys, the price of successive units of output brought decrease. And there are very good reasons for doing that, because the more consumers buy, the more likely it is that the monopolist can engage, can increase their production and benefit from economies of scale. So with this second-degree price discrimination, what you see are changes, step changes in the price. So if the consumer only buys output one unit of output, the monopolist would charge P1. But as the consumer increases their consumption from 1 unit to 2 units, there is a reduction in price from P1 to P2. That corresponds to point X, and that corresponds to the second unit of output bought. As the consumer buys a third unit of output, there is another decline in output. There's another decline in price to P3, which is below the profit maximizing price of the monopolist, and the price charged for that is only P3. But the point to emphasize with this diagram is that P3 is only charged for the third unit of output. So you're approximating a competitive market in the sense that the final unit bought, Q3, is charged a price where price is equal to marginal cost. Prior to the third unit of output being bought, price is much higher than the monopoly price, and it's significantly higher than the competitive price. So these sorts of things, sometimes referred to as tariff pricing. So the idea is that the more electricity you buy, the cost per unit of electricity declines. Storage heaters are usually charged overnight when electricity is cheaper than they are during the day. And it's basically an example of how bulk buying results in discounts in price to consumers. Okay. Now, stop sharing. The final type of price discrimination we're going to consider is what is known as third-degree price discrimination. And there are two important conditions which must be fulfilled for third-degree price discrimination to operate. To my PowerPoints. The first one is that the monopolist is able to segregate the total market into different groups. Each group is charged a different price, but everyone in the same group pays the same price. So some groups will pay a high price, some groups will pay a lower price. And for third-degree price discrimination to work, it is important that there must be barriers to movement of customers, so that a customer who is in a high price group cannot move to the low price group and benefit from the lower prices. Because if they could, there would be arbitrage opportunities. So you would buy in the low group and sell it to the high price group. And the third-degree price discrimination is built on the assumption that each group has a different price elasticity of demand. And we know from previous lectures that high prices will be charged in markets where the price elasticity of demand is low, and low prices will be charged in markets where the price elasticity of demand is very high. So to show you that, I'm going to share my screen again. Oops. I'm going to share my screen again. And I'm just going to go to the diagrams. And we have a standard diagram here, which I've not rotated again. But the basic idea here is that you have a monopolist. This function here is his average revenue curve. This here is the marginal revenue curve, and the monopolist's total marginal revenue curve is comprised of the marginal revenue in market 1 and the marginal revenue in market 2. So his total output is where marginal revenue cuts marginal cost. That is that point there. So the total output produced by the monopolist is QM. And what we want to know is how is QM allocated between the two markets. So the monopolist is producing a total output of QM, and he's going to sell that at a price of PM. But you've got two markets here. You've got market 1 here, and you notice that PM is less than the price actually charged in the market, which is P1. And you notice that in the second market, PM is higher than the price actually charged in market 2, which is P2. And the point to emphasize is that this output here and output Q2 equal the total output QM produced by the monopolist. So he's producing total output of QM, and he simply says to himself, how do I allocate this between these two markets, and at what price do I charge each market? Excuse me. Now, as I've just said, you can see in this first market that price 1 exceeds PM, and in the second market, price 2 is below PM. So we know that market 2 is more price elastic than market 1. So an example of this, for example, might be pizza delivery. So if you order a pizza, there's usually a discount for students if they can show their student card, whereas people like me, who are no longer a student, and presumably have a higher income than the average student, we don't get a discount, so we have to pay a higher price. The same thing also applies when you see haircuts advertised to old age pensioners. haircuts are discounted for old age pensioners and haircuts are discounted for students, but they're not discounted for me. Even though I have so little hair on my head, I should actually be treated as an old age pensioner. Okay, so what we've done is we've looked through 3 types of price discrimination. The recommended textbook by Liczynski, Goddard and Wilson has a very good discussion of these types of price discrimination and on tariff pricing and non-linear pricing. And you're encouraged to read that book on this topic to refine your ideas. Now, the final thing I want to look at is the issue, this final issue on slide 15, of whether price discrimination can be socially desirable. We know that price discrimination is socially desirable in the sense that first-degree price discrimination and second-degree price discrimination generate outcomes which are very similar to the outcome in a perfectly competitive market. And we also know that third-degree price discrimination seems appropriate. Why shouldn't consumers with a high level of income and who are less concerned by price, why shouldn't that group pay a higher price for their pizza than consumers such as students who are on a much lower level of income and who are much more concerned with budgeting? But the point I want to make in this final part of this lecture is to consider social desirability of price discrimination from another angle. In other words, would it encourage the monopolist to supply products that would not otherwise be supplied? And a situation where it is desirable that products are supplied, but the market does not supply those goods, that is referred to as market failure. It's not something we need to be too concerned about in this course, but you can see there are situations where consumers would like to buy a product, but the product is not supplied, and the product is not supplied because it is not profitable for the firm to produce the product. So what you have then is market failure. There is a level or a component of market demand which is not being satisfied. So to show you this, I want to take you to the final diagram of this lecture. And what you see there is a situation facing a standard monopolist. Okay, so the profit maximizing output is output Q, because that is where marginal cost intercepts marginal revenue. So that is sold at output Q, and it is sold at this price here. Okay, and what you see is that over this range 0 to Q1, which is the profit maximizing level of output for the monopolist, average revenue is below average cost. Therefore, charging a single price of P, which is here, would mean that the monopolist is incurring a loss supplying products to this market. So in that situation, the monopolist would not supply the product and there would be market failure. Now, one solution to this might be, for example, for the government to give the monopolist a subsidy to offset the losses that they incur in supplying this market. We'll come on to government pricing issues in the next lecture, but the point I want to emphasize with this diagram is that with price discrimination, it would be feasible and profitable for this monopolist to supply this market. And the reason for this is that you can see from this diagram there is clearly a range shown by P1 where average revenue price exceeds average cost, whereas here average revenue is below average cost. So what the monopolist could decide to do is to charge a very high price, and that is shown by P1 for output Q1, okay? And that revenue exceeds average cost, okay? So there is average cost, and there is price. So price is considerably above average cost, okay, over the output 0 Q1. And that surplus at point A, shown by the region A, could be used to compensate the monopolist for producing the extra output 0 to Q1. Okay? And the basic idea here is that the surplus made over 0 to Q1 by charging a very high price justifies the monopolist in reaching his profit maximizing output, which is Q rather than Q1. So what is happening is that over a limited range of the market, the monopolist charges a substantially high price, and the profits over that output 0 to Q1 are then used by the monopolist as a form of compensation to himself or herself for producing the profit maximizing level of output 0 to Q1. 0 to Q. Okay, and you can look at this in the textbook, and you can look at this in terms of other situations where these sorts of issues arise. Okay, so let's go back to the PowerPoints. Let's have some conclusions from this lecture as a whole, lecture 4. The first conclusion is that we have reviewed the key elements of privately and socially desirable pricing. In the first part of this lecture, we devoted it entirely to understanding why large-scale, vertically integrated firms and multinational companies pursue transfer pricing, and we considered what implications transfer pricing has. In the second part of lecture 4, we looked at price discrimination, and we considered the way in which price discrimination can generate outcomes which are similar to a perfectly competitive market. That is especially the case with first and second degree price discrimination. And we also considered other situations where price discrimination pursued by a monopolist can overcome market failure. I must say, I think that the textbook, the recommended textbook for this course, is very good on transfer pricing and price discrimination. But as I said in part 1 of this lecture, some of the diagrams used in the textbook for transfer pricing are a little bit complex. Okay, so just bear that in mind. That's it. That's the end of lecture 4. Thank you.